Hello and welcome to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, is our most ambitious project yet. Our plan is to look at the state of the comic book industry during a particular year, and then to examine in detail the major ways that Marvel Comics in particular evolved during that year. We'll look at who was creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics either debuted or ended. After that, we'll get down to business, take out our stack of Daredevil comics, and look at what our old friend, the Man Without Fear, was up to during that same time. We're glad you've joined us.
All right, Dwayne. So, we've had a little visit about comics and about Marvel. Now it's time to talk about Daredevil. Get in on the specialty of our man. You had quite a few books that you were looking at this year that he was in, and then we're going to talk about a few of them. What was going on in the world of Daredevil?
Daredevil had a busy year. The main books from his title were 262 to 275. Like I said, he got that extra bonus December issue there that snuck up on me. I didn't realize it was there. Marvel Tales 222, Marvel Comics Presents number 19, Saga of the Submariner number 9, What If number 1 and 2, Excalibur number 14, and Wolverine number 17 were the other places he made an appearance this year. As far as writing credits go, we talked about last year, and Nocenti, she continued on this year, had a writing credit in every single one of the books. She shared the writing credit with John Romita Jr. in issue 266. It was noted that the plot of the issue was by Nocenti and Romita Jr., and then the script was done by Ann Nocenti herself. As far as pencilers go, John Romita Jr. took basically the entire year except for one issue, which you noted a little bit earlier. Just issue 264, and we'll briefly talk about it, but Steve Ditko actually drew that particular issue, which was right smack dab in the middle of the Inferno crossover event. And then Al Williamson, who did a bang-up job on inks last year, did every book this year, but did share a inking credit with Mike Manley on issue 264. So we have that same group that did a really great job last year continue on this year. I have to say I'm not as thrilled with the results this year as I was last year. And to be perfectly honest, Inferno really, really took a great story that started in 1988 with Typhoid Mary and kind of sent it on its head, because as the year begins, Daredevil is lying at the bottom of a bridge, bleeding out, missing. Nobody can find him. He's presumed dead, and we don't know what exactly is going to happen. And what we end up seeing is Daredevil is coached, or maybe the more appropriate word is taunted, back to life by his old mentor, Stick. Meanwhile, New York City is seeing objects come to life and are attacking humans. Like I said, think Maximum Overdrive, the movie, or I don't remember the name of the Stephen King short story, but the same thing, which is part of this start of this big Inferno crossover event that's going on. So it's so weird because you have these like machine-looking things that are kind of like, I don't know, it looked like at the end of this issue, he's like fighting some inanimate object after coming back to life. And yeah, it's just sort of crazy.
If you're a comic fan from the 80s or 90s, it's like every machine in New York just turned into Warlock from the New Mutants. But if you're not a fan from the 80s or 90s, disregard that statement. It makes no sense to you.
It doesn't make any sense to me. But that's suffice to say. So that wasn't exactly how I expected that story to end, or how we'd figure out, or how we'd get a revived Daredevil back alive.
Yeah, it all seemed forced, and it's definitely one of those things where they're supposed to find ways to integrate into the story. But I think really that in this case they tried to get just a little too cute. And it would be fine to have just had the animated toasters running around, but the way this actually was done was just really confusing. Because you had all of these shadows that it was like he was hallucinating. It was stick, but it was not. And it was a machine that was then attacking him that looked kind of like I don't know. I'm not even sure what that machine was.
It looked like a mechanical grasshopper or something.
Yeah.
It's the best way I would describe it.
It had morphed to where it wasn't like any recognizable machine anymore. It was just something else. But in any case, yeah, that was unfortunate.
So he's alive, and Daredevil ends up going to the hospital, and Karen Page finds out he's there, shows up. Mary, who he's been kind of seeing on the side, shows up at the hospital as well. And they're both fawning over Daredevil / Matt Murdock in his hotel room. And it's at that point Karen realizes that Matt's been cheating on her. And she realizes it, and it is as awful as you would expect it to be. And she runs out and leaves, and he's just a terrible person yet again to his love interest. It's kind of disgusting.
Yeah. Yeah, he is not good at this. There's no question. And the whole thing is frustrating, and it's just weird how it doesn't really get dealt with particularly well either. I mean, in some ways it does, in that it's probably the way a lot of these things actually go, is that weird things happen and someone finds something out, and then it all kind of just blows up, and there's not really any resolution or whatever. But it's still disappointing that Daredevil wanders around with his little secrets until he gets caught and then whines about it for however long.
So after an issue hiatus featuring the Owl and the Bombers, because John Romita Jr. was getting married and wasn't available to draw, we see a resolution of sorts of the kind of Inferno event, at least with regards to the Daredevil run, in that Daredevil takes down a demon onslaught. And the actual colors and all this were actually just sort of crazy. It is kind of the best way I can put it. It was really something to look at, but really confusing. And the fact that there was like this issue break in between the second and third issue of this Inferno crossover was especially sort of kind of maddening, because obviously there wasn't anything that was going to go happen that mattered in this side issue. And it was just sort of a dumb issue about the Owl and old villains versus new villains and all this sort of thing. And then we get right back into the kind of craziness that was Inferno that then ended.
Yeah. And the way it ends, I mean, the idea is that actually, I think in the Marvel Universe, they essentially assumed that most people decided it was just a shared hallucination and tried to pretend it just never happened. Because I guess that's the only way that you can imagine folks would be able to go on with their lives. But it is just weird that as of like the next issue, everything's just back to pretty much normal? How does that happen? Like,
Yeah, yeah,
you
yeah.
just got eaten by your washing machine like 2 days ago, and now you're back to just heading out on the subway to go to work and not worried about things. I mean, it's very strange. But and then just in terms of the the disruption of having not only an event, but then having a fill-in issue in the middle of the event.
Yeah.
It's hard for this year to recover because you're already a third of the way into the year, and we've really had nothing except Daredevil fighting machines and a fill-in issue.
Yeah.
You know, it's just really got to slow down whatever kind of motion the series would have had coming out of 1988, and that's sad because they really did have some nice stuff there, and now they got to kind of just rebuild again.
Yeah, they had. I feel like they had great momentum going into the year, and then it just sort of got completely sidetracked by by the events of Inferno, and then that side issue. So, but this does end up leading to some pretty big changes. After spending Christmas in a bar with Mephisto as Daredevil, so he's in costume, sitting in a bar. He's approached by a woman. They're talking, drinking, all this sort of thing. Meanwhile, there's two guys that are brothers that are arguing at a table behind him, and ultimately one ends up stabbing and killing the other one while Daredevil's in the bar and doesn't do anything to stop him. Murdock decides
Doesn't
to
even
burn.
notice it.
Doesn't even notice him, and then Mephisto kind of materializes from the shape of the woman and basically, calls him on the fact that he's supposed to be a hero and didn't do anything to stop this that's going on immediately in the room that he's in. Murdock decides to burn all his belongings and leave New York City, which, okay, that's a thing you can do. I guess I wasn't expecting that because he's pining over Karen Page, and then starts striking up a conversation with a woman, and then this whole thing happens, and he's just, yeah, this is not great. And what follows is a string of stories about Matt Murdock being a loner and helping out as Daredevil where he can. He saves a man from a crashed plane, helps a man get out of an illegal loan sharking business. He saves a mutant girl from the Blob and Pyro. And then come September, we see Daredevil and Spider-Man team up in upstate New York. And that issue is going to be our spotlight story for this week. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, but it's sort of kind of crazy because he just sort of goes wandering in New York and just starts kind of dabbling. He ends up kind of in a bed and breakfast and ends up sort of overhearing what's going on and helps out the, people and this sort of thing. And I don't know.
He strings a guy up on a noose and then leaves with him standing on a chair.
Yeah, that's the thing.
That's one way to help people out, I guess. But he is very lost at this point because he wants justice, but there's just so much. Because the guy he hangs up is a bad dude who's been abusing other people and everything. But yeah, he's so we don't really know what happens. That one ends with maybe someone goes in the basement and saves him before he falls asleep or falls off the chair, and maybe they don't. Daredevil doesn't care. So, I'm not so sure how I feel about some of that. But anyways, that was, I think, though, a really good story in terms of the amount of pressure in that story. Like, it just seemed like everything was filled with dread and the possibility for things to go wrong.
Yeah.
I think that it was a really tightly written and drawn story that had some really good psychological heft to it. That was one of this year. This is one of my favorite stories, I think. Daredevil's dealing with some weird stuff, so it gets strange. But I do think that the way it's written and the interactions of all the characters and the like, it was pretty fantastic. So,
Yeah, I would.
268, I think.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. So next, Daredevil helps Brandy Ash expose her father's inhumane animal farm, which leads to the release of a young woman who's being experimented on, known as Number 9. This leads to a multi-book story arc that finishes out the year by introducing a new villain, Shotgun, and brings about the Inhumans as a kind of interesting sort of side tangent thing as well, because Brandy's father is presumably getting information from the Inhumans or something. It was really kind of weird.
Yeah. Yeah, that one I'm not so. But anyways,
yeah,
we'll talk about it. But yeah,
and then, like I said, I kept thinking that this was the end of the year, but then the year actually ends with a second December book that's part of the Acts of Vengeance event that shows Doctor Doom reviving Ultron and ordering it to destroy Daredevil, but it is conflicted by all the previous versions of itself. And then starts taking a liking to Number 9, who ends up finding it in the forest where it got revived, and is kind of talking to itself because it's got all these different Ultron heads and bodies and things in the forest, and she goes running off into the forest and happens upon this, and he's like talking to himself and doesn't know if he should listen to Doctor Doom or not. And yeah, it was a very interesting end to the year, actually.
Yeah, I'm intrigued because there are some of these books that, it seems like what Nocenti is trying to do is to really, and what she's best at, is writing books that have a lot of psychological heft to them. And then you get some of these where, books with Doctor Doom and Ultron usually are a little bit more just fun and the like. And I'm not so sure how some of this worked.
They're not as psychological. They're more just kind of pound fists sort of scenarios, I suppose.
I think, something along that. I would say not as deep. And Ultron can be, because he's always got a little bit of that, but it just seems like this went a little far. So I don't know. We'll see how it all goes. But the books this year seem more haphazard to me. Like, there are so many different things going on and so many different stories that I don't know that I really know what's the point of this year. Last year, things were pretty tight in a lot of ways. There was a through line. This one, it's kind of sometimes hard to find that through line. I will admit that I sort of love a lot of the art. I think that this is really some of my favorite John Romita Jr. artwork. I really have enjoyed a lot of his full-page splashes and stuff, a lot of other things. He's really done a nice job on these books. But the stories themselves just seem to kind of... And it's things like the addition of the 2 kids and all the other kids and everything. There's just so many plot lines and so many different strands to keep track of. And Daredevil's just sort of abandoned his life. What's the last time we see Foggy or Karen?
I don't think we see Karen in the second book when she runs out after realizing she's being cheated on.
And I'm correct that she doesn't come back the whole rest of the year.
She doesn't come back for the rest of the year, and we don't see Foggy at all this year.
And even Typhoid Mary, or do we see her after that situation with the Kingpin?
No, it's the first. We see them a little bit at the beginning of the year, and then that's it.
So basically, only during the Inferno parts, and then the next 9 to 10 issues is just Daredevil sort of detached from his entire supporting cast and wandering off into these sort of adventures. It's kind of like the Bruce Banner going through America in the TV show sort of thing. And it's kind of weird that, you know, the first 3 issues we had Daredevil actually talk about how, or Nocenti in some ways talk about how New York City was a tough place and it was a dirty place and there were all these things. And it's almost like literally he just leaves New York and takes off for a while, you know?
Yeah. Like I said, I had high hopes going into the year based on where we were going into the year, the momentum that we had, and it just sort of it landed flat for me. And I would have loved to have seen what this year could have looked like without that Inferno event at the beginning of the year.
Well, and even at the end, you know, the Acts of Vengeance, the reason that we're facing Doctor Doom is because of that one. Yeah. So at that point, you're talking about, yeah, a year with 13 books, but I guess 3 of them are 3 of them are Inferno, 1 is Acts of Vengeance, and 1 is a fill-in.
Yeah.
And to be quite frank, the other ones are a little bit lost too. I'm not really sure what would the year have looked like. Like, was Nocenti going to send him on this sort of vision quest anyway? Or did Inferno sort of make the story turn that direction, or what happened? So
that is I guess that is a good question. I'm not sure what direction it goes. It just feels like there's more options if you're not dealing with the Inferno event and the Acts of Vengeance event at the end. So
yeah. Nonetheless, I think that just the skill of Nocenti's storytelling at this point and the artwork that we're getting between Romita Jr. and Williamson makes these just technically well enough produced books that it's still a pretty good year of comics. I just don't know that it's not a signature year, partly because there isn't any real signature to it. You know, the beginning is sort of the results of that initial Typhoid Mary arc. And then we never really get a feel for what this next arc is yet. He's still sort of ramping into what all this is going to mean. So
let's say that after your discussion last week about Al Williamson, I really kind of was looking at the colors across these books, and they do really look spectacular, and I think it really makes some of the images that you see throughout these books just they just really resonated well. I think with regards to just making some of that over the top stuff look even more just fantastical, I guess maybe is the only way I can put it.
Well, that's an old friend of ours, actually, because the colors are Max Scheele, which is a pseudonym for Christy Scheele. And Christy Scheele was the colorist on those last issues of Moon Knight that we loved. So, like, if you remember the Stained Glass Scarlet and some of the coloring and on that, and like Hit Me and that was all Scheele. And so she is a fantastic colorist. And these are probably some of her last books, because I think she leaves to go off and do fine art stuff in the near period here. So yeah, when you look at, again, he's getting into it now. He's a few years into his career. But with Williamson on inks and Scheele on colors, Romita Jr. is not going to have a better presentation of his pencils than he's getting right now. Because these guys are first class, world class. Christy Scheele has become, an actual really solid, fine artist in her own right now. And her colors were probably near the top of the scale when she left. So
let's talk about what's new. Obviously, New Places, half the year takes place outside of New York City. though not outside New York State. Various small towns were not really given an exact location as to where he's at throughout most of this. He's just sort of bobbing around a little bit. It does sort of seem like it's upstate New York. He's not too far away. As far as new supporting characters, we have Amanda, who is a young mutant saved from the Freedom Force. We have Brandy Ash, who's a young ecologist who doesn't like her father's farm. We have number 9, the young woman experimented on by Skip Ash. And then we see the Inhumans, who in this iteration comprise Black Bolt, Medusa, Gorgon, and Karnak. And then as far as new villains, we see Mephisto, the demon lord who drinks with Daredevil in a bar as a young woman. Blackheart, who is Mephisto's son, who is in the Spotlight issue that we'll talk about. The Freedom Force is Blob, Pyro, and Spiral. We have Skip Ash, who's the terrible human to animals and to young women. Shotgun, who is the Special Forces, who's from Special Forces in the military, a member of the CIA that's called upon by Skip Ash to deal with Daredevil and his daughter when they start running amok on his animal farm. So some interesting characters throughout all this. I was not really familiar with the Inhumans before being introduced to them and some of the drama that was going on towards the end of the year with them.
Yeah, I'm not sure we would have ever read Inhumans in all the time we've been doing stuff. We've ended up with like Eternals and the like, but we've never done anything, I don't think, that would have gotten you any. The only time probably is when we read the Kree Skrull War back when we were looking at Avengers stuff, I believe. There were a few Neil Adams issues where they did have a few of them, but at best, that is like a cameo, and it would not have necessarily resonated. So, yeah, that's kind of crazy. They've been around for a long time. They are generally Fantastic Four associated, so a lot of times they're going to be semi-adversaries slash, co-protagonists with the FF, and then one of them, Crystal, actually joins the Fantastic Four for a while. So
we've talked about them a little bit. I just didn't really have any frame of reference to them, and then finally just matter-of-factly seeing them as part of the Daredevil run just sort of kind of was surprising to me. I was definitely not expecting that I would suddenly see the Inhumans, but here they are.
There's actually technically a whole society of them, and they can be really popular, or can be really powerful. So Kamala Khan was originally an Inhuman until they changed her to a mutant recently. So,
all right, I think that kind of covers in general what was going on with Daredevil this year. I think it's time we move on and talk about the Spotlight.
Sounds good.
This week's Spotlight story.
All right, Dwayne. Daredevil number 270, September 1989. The title is Blackheart. Tell us why this is your Spotlight book.
You know, this was a weird year trying to figure out what book I wanted to spotlight to talk about because of everything that went on at the beginning of the year with the Inferno event and everything. This book kind of stuck out to me because the story felt sort of random, and I wanted to highlight it just because I thought maybe there was a reason it was here, and I thought we could talk about it because I'm not familiar with Mephisto very much. I'm not familiar with with the sun that he kind of generates, Blackheart, but that's who this story centers around, and it kind of also encompasses part of that journey of him outside of New York that we saw that took basically half the year this year. So over centuries of time, a certain hill in the town of Christ's Crown, New York, has become saturated with blood of innumerable evil deeds, causing otherworldly thorns to grow. In the modern age, the evil continues to build when a woman is raped on that hill. This proves to be the breaking point, and the accumulated evil gives rise to a new demon. That demon's called Blackheart. Blackheart instantly kills both the rapist and the victim, and Mephisto appears to congratulate his new son on his first kill. Blackheart lashes out at his maker, though, and Mephisto chastises him. He tells Blackheart to move among the humans in disguise because he's weakened when mortals see him directly, and encourages him to perpetuate acts of sublime evil. This is quite the setup. And I didn't know where this was going. It felt very supernatural, almost surreal. Had kind of a very dark, an ominous beginning. I mean, you have this couple that ends up having this guy rapes this woman on this hill, and it's like, where is this going?
And it's weird because it also starts with 3 full-page spreads. So it starts out with kind of this idea of how that hill transforms from the 1650s into modern years and the like. And it's strange because you get through that, and then you see these kids and the like, and then you get another full-page spread. So 4 of the first 5 pages of this comic are full-page pages, one-panel pages. Blackheart, by the way, he's essentially created by, so he's not technically a normal son, but he's created by Mephisto.
Okay.
And Mephisto uses him essentially as almost this foil where he brings things to him and then tries to have them tempt. So that Blackheart tries to tempt Daredevil. There's all of these sorts of things. There's a lot of sort of that Christian idea of, the tempting of Jesus and that sort of thing and everything. And Blackheart is weird because he keeps coming back and does strange things. He's a Ghost Rider villain over time, and Mephisto is sometimes too. But there's times he poses as politicians and this sort of thing and the like. So I don't know that there's anything particularly interesting about him other than he's just a really powerful demon who can use sort of eldritch magic and that sort of stuff. So he's just basically a version of Mephisto that's a bit smaller and not quite as powerful and painted blue/black instead of red.
The thing that I wondered was, are we going to start seeing Mephisto now? Is this a thing? Because we had him in New York drinking with Daredevil before he leaves, and now we see them again in upstate New York, and he brings in Blackheart, and I'm just like, is this going to be kind of the villain that he ends up fighting a lot going forward? And it's this seems like a bit of a power imbalance.
It is, but also Mephisto in many cases is still interested more in corrupting people in some cases. So Daredevil and him fit in that Daredevil is always all about guilt and rage and justice, and Mephisto is about playing on people who are obsessed with these things. So he can show up all over the place. There are a number of different characters who Mephisto bothers over the years. Spider-Man has traditionally been kind of one of the most important, but he runs around all over the place. So yeah, we will see Mephisto every once in a while, not only in Daredevil, but just, causing trouble all over the Marvel Universe.
In Marvel Comics at large. Okay, got it.
Mm-hmm.
Got it. So elsewhere, Daredevil is exercising atop an abandoned roller coaster when he smells the presence of Blackheart. Realizing the entity has no heartbeat, Daredevil investigates, only to be attacked by bolts of black energy. By chance, Peter Parker happens to be riding by in a bus, and after seeing smoke, convinces the driver to stop and let him off. Daredevil battles the demon, bringing down the entire roller coaster on top of him and punching and kicking him, which has very little effect. Spider-Man then quickly joins into the fight, and soon a crowd gathers around to watch this super-powered brawl occur. But realizing that he's being watched, Blackheart stops fighting. So it is... Talk about right place at the right time, by the way, Dan. Peter Parker just happens to be on a field trip in upstate New York in a bus, and he's like, "Oh, look, strange things are going on at this abandoned amusement park. We should probably stop. I should probably, try and help out what's ever going on here."
Yeah, it's a little bit ridiculous. And really, it literally is, they just drop out in the middle of this place, and then he's like, "You must now walk among men." And it just turns out that Daredevil is within quick walking distance of this hill. And so there begins the fight. That Daredevil doesn't even really pick on him. He just shoots a bolt at him for essentially no reason, it seemed. So
Daredevil sees an opportunity to electrocute the creature and begins to do so, but Spider-Man stops him, realizing that might be exactly what he wants. So Blackheart, weakened by all these onlookers watching the fight, suddenly teleports away. Mephisto, who's been watching all the events in disguise, kind of gets exposed as being there by Daredevil because he realizes that, this creature that he's been fighting is now gone, and he sort of senses that Mephisto is there after previously encountering him in New York. What we find is Blackheart retreats to that site of his birth at Christ Crown's Briar Patch, and the closing panels, they have him wondering why he was born. So there's not really so much as a wrap-up as it just sort of ends, the story does. And you're like, okay, so Mephisto has this like surrogate Blackheart that he's now kind of doing things with, and now presumably he's going to be somebody that Daredevil is going to be dealing with going forward, or at least we're going to see again. It was just sort of a weird random story. And spoiler alert, I've actually read it into next year, and this isn't the last we see of Mephisto or Blackheart, which, I'm not sure I'm loving this particular villain as somebody that is a good foil for our man Daredevil.
Yeah, the problem with these guys is that they not only have kind of the religious and ethical sorts of things going on that would make them interesting for Daredevil, but they have such an outsized power set that they're kind of ridiculous, actually. I mean, it doesn't really matter how well, in terms of their motivations, like a guy with a stick and a guy with a bazooka, match up. They're not going to make a great set to, put against each other, because one's going to completely destroy the other. And that's kind of the way that these are. But it is nonetheless, I think, one of those where more and more Nocenti's getting into almost like the religious connotations, and like she's taking a lot of the stuff that Miller dealt with, I think, almost more intuitively, and she's trying to deal with it more sort of intentionally. And the problem with that is that sometimes when you do that, you just go a little bit too far, and it just seems, I don't know, like it's preachy, or it's a little bit forced or something. So she's going to have to watch that. This one, I think sometimes this year went a little bit far into that, where it seemed like it was just a little bit too into the, he's beating himself up because he shouldn't have betrayed Karen, and so now he's wandering around doing penance throughout the country and eventually having to be tempted by demons and everything else. But, such is the way.
I think that pretty much covers the spotlight for this week. I don't know that I've got anything more to add on this. Dan, should we move on and talk about the takeaway for this year? This week's takeaway. All right, Dan, we finished up talking about 1989. What is the takeaway for this year? How do we, when we look back at the end of the 80s, as we move in towards 1990, what should be our takeaway when we're looking at what's going on in comics?
I think to me the takeaway has to be that comics are still standing. That essentially, when we go back and look at, if you re-listen to the 1979 episode, right? There were numerous times, if you're listening to that one, where you hear me talk about how there are people within the industry, both in terms of creators and publishers and even retailers, who are starting to plan for what's next after the end of the comic industry. Because it seems like the newsstand sales are collapsing. The direct market, while there's some potential there, doesn't seem like it's going to be able to maintain an entire industry. And so that's maybe helping a little bit, but not enough. You've got all sorts of problems with the fact that creators don't have the kind of incentives to actually make anything interesting. There's just so many problems with comics in the late 70s, and so much pessimism. And now, 10 years later, you have this industry that has essentially blossomed. Marvel and DC are stronger than ever. You do have a bunch of the smaller companies that have gone away, and so there is some danger there because we're nearing monopoly type levels in terms of big two. But there's also still all of these smaller companies popping up, and there is a channel in the direct market for them to be able to succeed. We've gotten through the black and white boom and bust, so that some of those companies and some of those retailers are now going to be able to start carrying more books. Comics are selling more than they did in the 70s, and you're starting to see things like the Batman movie and some of these things that are getting more interest. We have gone from a doom and gloom scenario at the beginning of this decade to a very promising future in which there will be no problems in the next 4 years that will just about blow away comics forever, and we're going to be fine. So
you say that with a smile on your face, so I can't wait to see what must be coming.
There's always a disaster around the bend, but at this point, I think that most people who are into comics would look at this and say that in terms of creator rights, in terms of the quality of books that are being put out, in terms of where comics are at compared to where you might have thought they'd have been 10 years ago, this is nearly a best case scenario. And the one caveat I would have for that, of course, is that most of those folks are thinking of this in terms of established creators and established fans, and not really worried about the fact that we do have a relatively substantial problem with the loss of the newsstand market and the loss of young readers. But that's a problem, again, for next decade. For right now, things are looking really, really good in the comic market. And this is an interesting and a solid place to start the next decade for comics.
I would think that from their standpoint, it's got to feel pretty good that they're kind of in a much more sort of secure footing, at least as the big two anyway. That it's not we're on the knife's edge, and if we go teeter too far one way or the other, we could fall off. We're probably in a safe position, and they can go and they can keep doing the thing they've been doing, and presumably it's going to continue to keep making them some money.
Well, and even for creators, with profit sharing and royalties, with the fact that a lot of them are able to either get paid for their creations or keep the rights to their creations, with the fact that there are things, that are ability, there's places where you can go to self-publish your own stuff and succeed with it. It's just a much better outlook in terms of making a living being a comic book creator than there would have been a decade ago.
That's a good takeaway, and I think it's definitely something to keep in mind as we jump into the 90s.
I can be positive, Dwayne. I can be. See?
I am very curious to see where this positivity is going to lead us.
It's going to lead us to 1994, but we've got a few years until then, so enjoy for now. It's the salad days coming up.
That's going to put a wrap on this week's show. We'd like to thank you for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. If you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you'd share the show via social media or leave us a review. That will help new listeners find the show much easier. Whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts about this week's show. You can send those to us via email at comments@comicsovertime.com or via Twitter or Blue Sky. We're at Comics Over Time there. Until next week, take care, everybody.